of the North Star.
Good afternoon and welcome. According to the China briefing, the U.S. and China are locked in a rapidly escalating tit-for-tat tariff war triggered by aggressive trade measures introduced on Trump's so-called Liberation Day. Why did Trump choose to pick this fight? What's the anticipated outcome? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better analyze and understand the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, on April 9th, the U.S.'s 145% tariff on Chinese goods came into effect, along with another range of additional duties on other global trade partners. This came after China announced it would impose an 84% tariff on U.S. goods starting a couple of days ago. Why? My guest is the founder of the Center for Political Innovation. He's an author, independent journalist, political analyst, reporter for RT, and his latest book is entitled Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. He is Caleb Maupin, and as always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure, glad to be here. Good to see you. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for joining us. I want my guests, my audience, to understand that I reached out to you because of your great depth of knowledge as it relates to China, their politics, and some of their thought processes. So I really, really appreciate you joining the show today. China's State Council Tariff Commission announced it has raised tariffs on U.S. imports from 84% to 125%, and now have raised them, I think, even further, matching the U.S.'s reciprocal tariff on Chinese goods implemented earlier. Caleb, let's start with a simple question. Why do you think Donald Trump chose to pick this fight? And I think it's important for people to really understand my stressing chose to pick this fight.
Well, there's a number of factors that go into this, but I think the reason that we're seeing these dramatic tariffs from the Trump administration has more to do with Western inside baseball than it does with China. That Donald Trump is kind of the U.S. incarnation of a trend that's happening all across the Western world that we can call the new right. He is very much battling against what he calls the globalists, and that's the World Economic Forum, that's the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the the kind of Western financial system that exists. And Donald Trump represents a layer of wealthy people in the United States who feel that the United States is not really benefiting from that, who feel that it would be better if the U.S. government were to craft policies in line with serving the interests of the domestic U.S. economy rather than kind of being a team player in the so-called collective West. That's why we see Trump criticizing NATO. That's why we see Donald Trump taking different moves in different parts of the world that I'm sure we'll get into later in the conversation. However, in order to justify himself to his base, he has to target China because while he seems to not really be on board with demonizing Russia in the same way, and he's actually straying with Middle East policy, very surprisingly, in ways that I certainly didn't expect, he feels a need to justify himself to American corporations and manufacturers who see China as a competitive rival, and to justify himself to those who view China as an aggressor, who buy into this rhetoric. I know, in his previous administration, you had Peter Navarro, who's just a hack, who's made his whole career out of, just blaming China for every economic problem in the world. And so Donald Trump is trying to justify an overall break with U.S. economic policies and kind of a pivot to a more domestic-based economic policy. And in order to do that, he has to very dramatically grandstand against China. But I would argue this is more about disagreements within the Western world. And I'll also add it's a devastating and disastrous policy because I'm looking at the big picture. I liked how in your introduction you talked about the big picture. Mm-hmm. In the big picture, in the grand scheme of things, we know which way the world is going. And this Western global financial system is dying, and the alternative to it is rising. And that alternative is centered around China and Russia, but it includes countries like Burkina Faso that are having an agricultural explosion right now. Burkina Faso just announced they're going to start paying a stipend to all the students who attend university there. They've also made medical care for pregnant mothers completely free because they want to increase their population. Nicaragua, which I've been to, I've seen the great achievements of their planned economy and what the Sandinistas have done. There's a whole section of the planet that is breaking out of this Western system and growing and building. Meanwhile, the Western system, the IMF and the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, they're openly saying the only hope for their system is degrowth, reducing consumption, reducing the population. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy about it. You'll live in a pod and you'll eat bugs, and growth is bad. That's openly the way they're talking. So the only hope America has in the long term is to break out of the Western system and attach itself to the rising new world that is pro-growth. And for the United States to do that, putting up barriers and engaging in trade warfare against the Chinese economy is a disastrous move, and it's not the correct move. Now, Donald Trump is doing it as he's trying to prove something to other Western leaders, trying to justify himself to people who might agree with some of the distance he's placing between the NATO countries and the United States. And Donald Trump is playing kind of a strange game, but this aspect of what he's doing is not beneficial to America, and it's not beneficial to the world in the long run. We need to be closer to China because the so-called collective West is in decline, which Donald Trump, to some degree or other, realizes that. So we should be getting closer to China, closer to Russia, closer to Iran and Venezuela, and we should be getting further away from Britain and France and Germany and the decaying NATO internationalist global order.
I've taught public policy on at a number of different points in my academic career, and I would always say to my students, when you start trying to assess policy, that you have to separate the theoretical from the practical. That we can find ourselves discussing a number of things that sound really sensible, but when you try to implement them as a public policy, then that sounding sensible breaks down quickly because you have to replicate these kinds of things over a much larger scale. And so this tariff policy, first of all, from the theoretical side, doesn't even make sense. But I don't really hear the analysis of this starting from the point of, why did the United States deindustrialize in the first place? We brought this on ourselves as the manufacturing base in the country sought greater profit by looking for cheaper labor. And so we as the United States industrial base, made a conscious decision to deindustrialize the country. So, and China said, as they're trying to bring their population out of abject poverty and trying to expand the size of their middle class, they said, we'll take the jobs gladly. We will do this willingly. Thank you very much, the United States. And now, I don't hear any of that part of the reality being discussed or as a basis of the current explanation of all of this that we hear in mainstream media. Is that too simplistic for me to say?
Well, I would go even further. And I would point out that I think the biggest jobs killer in American industry hasn't been offshoring, it has been technology, technological development, automation. And that points to a bigger question, which is that the US leaders and the Chinese leaders have a fundamental disagreement about how wealth is created. Where does wealth come from? The source of all wealth in this world is human creativity, human labor power, and natural resources. But aside from natural resources and human creativity and human labor power, you really don't get wealth from other places. However, there is very much a belief on the part of the Western leaders that human beings are a problem. Human beings are the source of economic stagnation. There's the Malthusian conception, right? That economic crises are caused by overpopulation. This is not correct. And it is human labor power that is the source of all wealth. And China has made a decision as a country to invest in the source of all wealth, in its people. And that's why they have many, many engineers and many, many scientists. That's why they have done their best to lift people out of poverty and provide people with the basic necessities of life. And that's why they have a largely planned economy, even though there's a lot of private corporations, but they have 5-year economic plans and they have state-controlled industries and they strategically plan out the credit and the lending of money because they would like to see growth overall and they would like to invest in their population. Whereas here in the United States, we don't engage in such policies. We don't invest in our population. We have an educational system that is a disaster. When Trump was first in office, there was an article that was published, and it pointed out that Trump was claiming he was going to make Apple produce their iPhones in America. And Apple came forward, and they said, we could not do that, even if you made us, even if we wanted to, because we don't have the apparatus in terms of infrastructure to do it, and we don't have the engineers and the scientists here that would do it. It wouldn't be possible for Apple to make their iPhones in America, because with our crumbling roads and with our population that doesn't have enough educated people to oversee the project, it just wouldn't be possible. That you have to invest in physical economy, not simply in our economy is largely based on what Marx called fictitious capital. These betting on stocks and derivatives and speculation and all of that stuff. And that is not real economy. And if human labor power is not becoming more productive, if the population is not expanding, if living standards and consumption are not increasing, you're not really experiencing economic growth. And any economic growth that you would experience that doesn't result in that is simply a bubble that's waiting to burst. And I think that there is a fundamental disagreement about the nature of economics that puts the Western system at odds with the rising BRICS economy and the New World in the East. And that while Trump seems to have opposition to some of the most powerful entities in the Western system, and he seems to be, very much trying to pivot into, in line with what more domestic corporations want, they still believe in neoliberalism. Peter Navarro, Elon Musk, they still believe that if you just get the government out of the way, that you can naturally have economic growth, and that this kind of flim-flam Austrian school, Chicago school, libertarian economics, it does not work, and it has never worked anywhere. There's many examples of it not working. When they imposed these policies dramatically in Chile, we saw a humanitarian economic crisis that wasn't resolved until the early 1980s, when the Chilean government got rid of Milton Friedman and started very dramatically moving to impose state control and nationalize industries. And then they were able to recover. After the fall of the Soviet Union, in many different countries throughout the former Soviet bloc, former Eastern Bloc, you saw many dramatic implementations of free trade policies and Chicago Austrian school, get the government out of the way economics. And it was absolutely disastrous. The essence of the problem is that you cannot cut your way into economic growth.
Correct.
That you just can't cut your way into economic growth. Austerity economics does not work. If you have less, you can't have more. The way to have more is to have more. And if you have less, you get less. And from conservatives, having less comes in the form of cutting government subsidies, getting rid of government employees, et cetera. And that's what we're seeing with the Doge, which I think is disastrous. And degrowth comes in the form of kind of, government forcing of downsizing, restrictions and regulations that make smaller better, the Green New Deal, energy policies that want to reduce energy output, et cetera. But you just can't have more by having less. You cannot cut your way into economic growth. And China is all about growth. And if you look at the 5-year plans, and if you look at the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, they are all about growth. Xi Jinping, his first trip to the United States came when he was a very young man in the 1980s, and he went to Muscatine, Iowa, and he slept in a farmhouse in Muscatine, Iowa, because he was there to study the agricultural machinery that was used in America. And he was just the mayor of a small town at that point, and he went and he slept in this farmhouse, and he went back to the village that he was in charge of, and he doubled and I believe tripled the income of the people there by increasing their agricultural output. And now that house that he stayed in, a replica has been built of it in China, including the Star Trek wallpaper on the teenage son's bedroom. And it's like a museum. Chinese people pay money to go and see this replica of the American farmhouse that Xi Jinping slept in when he was the mayor of a small district, and he delivered results based on what he learned from studying American agricultural techniques. He brought that back to China, and as he improved things in the rural village, he was promoted. He ended up in regional leadership. Now he's the head of the country because he's a guy who knows how to deliver when it comes to growth. That's Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, they are all about economic growth. That is the basis of their justification. Every year they come back and they say, we delivered this much growth. And that is how they justify continuing to be in power. And that's how they enact and carry out their policies. They are pro-growth. And we have gotten into this notion in the West that somehow growth is bad. And that is a very, very dangerous conception.
To your point, you can't grow your economy without manufacturing. That there are some fundamental elements to this that again seem to be left out of the analysis. Because when we hear, and I've said this many times, when we listen to the current analysts talk about how strong the United States economy is, they're talking about the financialized side of the ledger. And that's a very, very narrow perspective on the strength of the U.S. economy. And again, you can't grow your economy without a strong man. You have to make something of value in order for people to buy what you make, and so that money can then recycle throughout your economy. And I want to stress to something that you also said about the Chinese. They invest in their people, as the United States is cutting the Department of Education and now threatening to cut money to institutions of higher education. And China invests in R&D, hence the BYD electric vehicle. And those are two things that you said China has engineers. Why? Because they train engineers. It's damn near They grow engineers. That's what they do. And to your point about growth, to China's point about growth, they grow to get people out of abject poverty. Hence, they invest in their people. Caleb Maupin.
Sure. You can talk about this on many different levels, but, the world has really changed. And that I think a lot of the people in the Trump camp, they want to frame this as capitalism versus communism. They want to present Joe Biden and his disastrous economic policies as communism because they involved government oversight. They want to get rid of communism. They want to deregulate things. This is such an incorrect way of understanding things. When you look at China, for example, right? China's a civilization. It's been around for thousands of years. One thinker that has been very influential, very, very, very influential, was Confucius. During the Mao years in the 1970s, there was a campaign called Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius, where Mao Zedong, during the Cultural Revolution, tried to wipe out Confucius. Didn't go so well, but after Mao died, the Chinese Communist Party backed away from that. And now in China, with Xi Jinping's leadership, there's a revival. And it's a revival of interest in both Mao and Confucius, right? For a while in the 1980s and 90s, they were not emphasizing Mao so much, but they were trying to revive interest in Confucius. But now Confucius and Mao, two leaders, one who tried to kind of wipe the other one out of China's memory, they kind of walk hand in hand. And Confucius is very much about filial piety, the respect of a teacher for their student, the respect of a child for their parent, etc. A very conservative and traditional thinker. Mao Zedong said it is right to rebel, and he, mobilized a revolution against the landlords and had the Chinese youth criticize and denounce their teachers for straying from the communist line. And Mao was all about it is right to rebel and was trying to build an egalitarian communist world. But their pictures are both hanging all across Beijing because both of them represent China's unique identity that is not Western. And they're both part of China's identity, and they're both collectivists rather than individualists. Now, Confucius is more of a traditional conservative collectivist. Mao Zedong is a communist, revolutionary, left-wing, socialist collectivist. But they're both collectivists in opposition to liberalism, which liberalism is the Western way of viewing things. In the West, we believe in the individual above all else. There's an old TV show called The Twilight Zone that I keep thinking about.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, it's from the early 1960s, late 50s. And there's an episode of The Twilight Zone that is it's perfect liberal propaganda. And it's called To Serve Man. And, some space aliens come to Earth and, everyone's surprised because they're really nice space aliens and they're feeding people and they're expanding the human life expectancy and they cure cancer and they're doing all these nice things. And they ask the space aliens, oh, why are you doing that? And they always point to this book they hold up. And they say, well, we have this book To Serve Man. And so they have a spaceship and they're going to take some humans back to their planet, back to their home planet. And they're loading them up. And there's this woman who's been trying to translate the book To Serve Man. And as the people are getting on the ship, at the end of the episode, she runs out and she says, to serve man, it's a cookbook. It's a cookbook. And that was a classic moment in American television. It's a cookbook. And the message of that episode is that, if somebody comes along and is trying to offer free healthcare and free education, don't fall for it. They're actually trying to eat you alive and kill you. And to serve man, right? That was the name of the book. The Chinese Communist Party, their slogan was serve the people. And they had just come to power. It was actually that episode of The Twilight Zone was based on a short story that came out just a few years after the Chinese Communist Party had come to power. And that story is basically trying to preach this kind of paranoia. Don't ever be part of a joint effort. Don't ever get involved in some kind of collective operation because it's all just a plot and they're going to eat you alive, right? And you just got to be individual, everyone for themselves, and don't be fooled. And it was very much an anti-communist, a coded anti-communist message, right? Which is that the communists promise free healthcare, free education, and jobs, but at the end of the day, they just want to devour you and eat you alive, right? And that's how we think in the Western world. And The Twilight Zone was a liberal television show. At the same time, there was a lot of anti-communism on it. There were a lot of digs at Joe McCarthy and a lot of digs at the right wing and conservatism and stuff. And that kind of anti-collectivism And this notion that we can't have joint effort, we can't come together, we can't have what Xi Jinping calls a shared destiny for all mankind. We can't have that because if we do, it's totalitarianism, and we're all going to be eaten alive or killed. That's how we think in the Western world. And again, the left kind of manifests that in terms of the cancel culture and the wokeism and the pessimism, and the right manifests it in terms of economics, in terms of this crazy free market ideology that says the state has no obligation to improve people's lives. Well, I would disagree with that. I would say if you look at the great works of literature, if you look at, there would have been no Shakespeare if there hadn't been monarchs and British, leaders who'd said, we really ought to have some theater for the people. You would never have had the painting of the Sistine Chapel. You would never have had Beethoven and Bach and his great work if there wasn't an effort by leaders to say, we want to make our people better. We want to improve the culture. We want our people to be smarter. We want our people to have a better understanding. So they subsidize the great works of art. And the computer revolution, right? We would not have computers if it wasn't for the fact that during World War II, the British government, the British military went and found a mathematics genius, that mathematics genius, Alan Turing, and they put him to work making a decoding machine. And it wasn't the free market that did that. There's many examples. And if you look at Apple and Microsoft and all of that, that was all done by state coordination, state decision making. And the Soviet Union, despite having nowhere near the level of Western resources to invest in, they still developed the first mobile phone. Leonid Kaprianovich in 1957 had the first mobile phone. They launched the first satellite into orbit. This notion that the state can't be involved in trying to raise up productive forces and trying to improve the lives of the people, that is a toxic notion, and that's liberalism.
The internet came from the Department of Defense and DARPANet. Yeah. There was no free market involved in that.
Yeah, and we have just been inculcated with this fear of collectivism, this fear of state power, and it's leading to an economic crisis here in the West. And in the East, they don't have that same phobia. That's my point. That's what I was making my point about the Twilight Zone, et cetera. So
and again, one of my favorite shows, and you hit that one. You hit that one spot on. And not to take us too far afield, but I've been saying for years that one of the big problems within the African American community and our inability to capitalize on the advancements of the civil rights movement is we have lost the understanding of the power of the collective, and we have bought into the mindset of individualism in American capitalism, in American democracy. And I tell folks all the time, Du Bois wrote the souls of Black folk, not the soul of some guy. Mrs. Hamer sacrificed not so that she could vote, but so that we could vote. But again, this sense of collectivism and that we all move forward together has been compromised by this misbelief in the power of the individual. And thank you, Kevin. I must be right, because Kevin Baptiste says that I'm spot on. So Kevin, thank you. I must be right. And to the point about government oversight, and one of the things that I think people miss out on in many instances is when they, the conservatives love to talk about red tape and government oversight. And I understand the problem that government oversight causes on the business side, but what rarely gets examined are the people that benefit on the human side. And the case that I always bring to mind is thalidomide, and the drug that was introduced to help women deal with morning sickness after pregnancy wound up causing birth defects. But if you hadn't had the government managing this process and overseeing this process, thalidomide might still be on the market today.
Indeed.
So there is a place for you need government oversight, because because markets in and of themselves, free markets in and of themselves, just won't do it.
No, I mean, I hear things said by advocates of this kind of economic flim-flam that has really caught on in the United States. They say things like no monopoly would exist if it wasn't for the government. I mean, I'm sorry, how can you say that with truth? There's what's called natural monopolies. They naturally arise. There's all kinds of antitrust legislation that the owners of business themselves really want the government to impose, because if not, there would be monopolistic concentration and there would then be stagnation in the economy, and that you have to have antitrust laws to break up, corporations. A great example of this, there was a Chinese billionaire who I believe he owns AMC movie theaters, and he said he was going to buy one of the top 7 Hollywood studios 10 years or so ago. And the government said, no, you can't do that, because there is a law that if you own a chain of movie theaters, you can't own a studio. Why? Because you would only show your own movies, and then there would not be competition among the movie studios. And pretty soon we'd only have one movie corporation. And so there are laws like that. I used to work in the insurance industry, and there are all kinds of laws that exist to prevent practices that would lead to monopolies in the insurance field. And that this idea that I frequently hear, they say, oh, there would never be any monopolies if it wasn't for the government. That is simply not the case. But these are the kind of things that neoliberal economists generally push, which, interestingly, the majority of academic economists do reject it. The majority of academic economists in the United States are what you would call Keynesians, meaning that they believe the government should spend money. They're not Marxists. Marx talked about the problem of overproduction, the value crisis, the tendency of the falling rate of profits. John Maynard Keynes said the issue was underconsumption. Keynesian economics, the classic example is, you hire the guy to go out and dig a hole, and then you hire another guy to go and fill the hole in, and somebody says, well, that's a waste of money. But actually, both of those guys got a paycheck, and they went and spent their money with that, and that got the economy going again, and that increased consumption, and et cetera. And that's Keynesian economics, this notion that the state should spend money. And after the Second World War, there was what you called the Keynesian consensus, which was a feeling to make sure something like the Great Depression that gave rise to fascism in the Second World War, to make sure something like that never happened again, there was a feeling that we need the government to spend money. And the greatest episode of economic expansion in all of human history, again, these are facts that, I mean, they should be obvious, but, they're just, so many people are the greatest episode of economic expansion was the post-World War II economic boom. After World War II, from, 1947 all the way up into the early 1970s, 1971, or some people say 73, there was more economic growth in the world than ever before in history. And that was the age when in the West, you had the welfare state, right? You had in Europe, you had Britain creating their national health care service. You had full employment in France, the state hiring people. Unions are very powerful, the European welfare state. That was the age when communism was rapidly expanding across the world. China was lifting itself up. The Soviet Union was rebuilding after the Second World War, inventing space travel. That was also the time where in the developing world, in countries that weren't communist aligned, you had a lot of kind of military regimes like Park Chung-hee in South Korea, who used the military to create a steel industry, to create a car industry, an electronics industry, to basically have a boom in South Korea, where you had the Shah of Iran, who was building railroads, etc. And there was almost no free market policies anywhere in the world during the world's greatest economic expansion. It was the era of the Keynesian consensus, where everyone had decided, no, that free market stuff, that just doesn't work. And we want to make sure nothing like the Great Depression ever happens again. No one started talking about free market economics. No one, with power started talking that way until the end of the post-World War II economic expansion. And that's when you begin to see the rise of neoliberalism. Milton Friedman starts to become more popular, the Montpellier Society, the Austrian School, and Hayek, and all of this stuff is pushed. And it's really just a response to the economic downturn. It's that the rich want to make us pay for their economic crisis. And so to justify it, they say, oh, if we cut government jobs, if we lay off government workers, that will cause economic growth. And neoliberal economics, Austrian school, Chicago school economics has always been a cover for the needs of the system. The system needs to cut and make the people pay for the crisis that the system has created, and that's what I would argue Austrian school neoliberal economics has always been. And China is the opposite of that. China has an economy, and again, we'll point to things that I often hear. People will say, well, China proves that the free market is the way to do it, Caleb, because in the 70s, they were much more communist, in the 50s and 60s, and now they have more free markets. That proves everything works, And I say, well, that's interesting. The other day it was cold in my bedroom, and I was a little cold, so I turned the heater on, and I got more comfortable. So therefore, I should light my room on fire because more heat is always the answer, clearly. I mean, you look at China's economy, is there more market than there used to be? Absolutely. But it's still a heavily state-run economy. They have about 50% state ownership in industry, and they have 5-year economic plans, and even private companies are not free to produce whatever is profitable. They are dictated and directed by the party. And the major corporations of China, they don't really function according to market laws because the state is their main investor. You look at Huawei Technologies, which is the greatest cell phone manufacturer. They make the best phones in the world, far better and more efficient than Apple and iPhones. They last longer. They've got better cameras. They're just amazing phones. That corporation, it's technically a private company, but its primary investor is Chinese military entities, and its activities are directed in line with the Chinese 5-year plan. So, yes, it has foreign investors, and yes, those investors get a return on a profit, but it's not functioning according to the market. It's functioning according to the overall state central plan, which is ensuring that there's economic growth. And that's what people don't seem to understand. China has an economy that utilizes the market and utilizes innovation. It lets people start their own business, etc. But it has a state that guides the whole thing. And that state is forcibly and is obsessed with delivering on the demand for economic growth. And so that is what we need to understand about China. And that is a very successful model. They have a pro-growth government in China. Here in the United States, we have an anti-growth government. And that's what Biden was. And then we have a section that says, oh, we just get the government out of the way. Well, no, I think we ought to have a pro-growth government, a government that understands its duty is to improve and raise living standards. And interestingly, there's a history of that in our country. The Alexander Hamilton, that's what he advocated with his policies calling for the creation of a national bank, with the way he had the state build lighthouses in the early years of the American Revolution. He basically argued that the state should be involved and that there should be a national bank, and the state has an obligation to oversee the economy and bring about growth. So these are not foreign ideas to the United States. I want to look at all of this. The way we think about economics in America is very wrong, and it's delivering very, very bad results. Our living standard has been going down. Our life expectancy has been going down. In China, their living standard and life expectancy has been going up and up and up and up. And I think we should be learning from their successes rather than just trying to build walls and cut them off. Oh, I can't hear you.
I think they refer to the Chinese economy as capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and that makes an awful lot of sense. You just mentioned the rich want us to pay for their economic crisis, and Kevin Baptiste, thank you very much for that super sticker with the question, could Caleb elaborate on Trump using his idiotic tariff policy to replace taxes being paid by the rich, and why?
Well, I'm not sure that's exactly what he's doing. I think, again, that Donald Trump is playing kind of a strange game where he is trying very much to diss the overall Western financial system and kind of decouple the United States from it and assert independence. And as he does that, he has to justify that by really sticking it to China. The only way he can get some of the people, who might not be willing to go along with it, as they would, is he has to show that he's being really hard on China while he's also harder on Western countries. And I think that is the game that Trump is playing, and that his cabinet is full of anti-China folks. As far as the tariffs, the other thing is it is a negotiating tactic, as we've seen. Vietnam, another country led by a communist party, another country that's had an economic miracle, right? Read what's been written about Vietnam's economic miracle. I mean, they have, with their planned economy, they call it a socialist-oriented market economy. They've had real achievements, and they were hit with a huge tariff, and they called up Donald Trump, and the leader of China the leader of Vietnam negotiated it, and it was over. And now all the tariffs on Vietnam have been lifted. Trump wanted to get certain concessions from the Vietnamese leadership, and he got it. And I mean, this is Trump very much grandstanding and trying to perform. And there are, I mean, the thing about tariffs is that they do benefit the profits of the owners of domestic corporations because they weaken their competitors. That they do that, right?
But you have to make something domestically in order for that to work.
Right. And also there's, the idea that these are all just going to create a bunch of jobs. That's not happening. I mean, it's like, I don't see these corporations going out and hiring all kinds of people now. It's not happening. One thing that has been,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but on that point, that's a often used trope that is used to explain everything. Well, we got to pump, if in the midst of this crisis, if we give more money to the banks, that money will trickle down like rain. The voodoo economics of the Reagan administration. If we bail out these failing industries, they'll take that money and create more jobs. But what do? They take that money, they buy back their stock, and they artificially inflate the value of their corporations.
A big part of Austrian school, and particularly Milton Friedman's interpretation, is he's into monetary theory and the value of money, and that he really advocates what you can call reverse inflation, which is trying to increase the value of currency. And I think that, obviously we saw a lot of inflation under Biden. So part of reverse inflation is basically reducing the amount of money in circulation, making it harder for people to spend. And laying off government workers, part of the reason that is a policy of reverse inflation is because, that's a lot of times government workers that's money that's printed that is paid to them. Right. So making it harder for Americans to spend money because we can't import as many products, reducing the amount of products there. That's reverse inflation. And this was a big thing. This was a big theme in the Nazi state. The Nazi state, they get credit for their, economic boom in the first few years, but they engaged in reverse inflation policies where, for example, they created universal full employment by basically shaming and pushing women out of the workforce. And they increased the marriage bonus and they basically had a public relations campaign that, a woman who's working is taking a job from a good German man who has kids to feed. And by basically making it socially unacceptable for German women to work in factories, they were able to create a situation where there were no men unemployed in Germany. Now, are you getting more wealth produced? No, but you have universal employment because you've removed a whole bunch of people from the workforce, right? And that's what reverse inflation kind of policies are. It's like you create a situation where the value of our money will increase because we're all poorer. And that's reverse inflation. And that's kind of Milton Friedman's trademark is, let's reduce the amount of money in circulation in order to make the value of money increase. And so there's some speculation that Joe Biden's advisors may be trying to implement a reverse inflation policy. They're not openly stating that.
You mean Donald Trump's?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Donald Trump's advisors may be trying to implement reverse inflation. They're not openly stating that at this time, but that is something that they may be saying behind closed doors.
Whether they're saying it or not, that is a huge impact in terms of what they're doing. Wanted to go back to Xi and his response to Donald Trump, basically saying, if you want to fight, we will fight. Would much prefer to have a conversation with you and negotiate these issues with you. But if you want to fight, we'll fight. And so now he is on a tour of Southern Asia. Yesterday he was in Hanoi. I think today he was in Malaysia, and he's on his way to Cambodia. and to meet also with the leader of in Hanoi, To Lam. And I find it very, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, very shrewd and very calculating in terms of where he's going, who he's talking to, and the things that he's trying to implement in Southeast Asia.
Well, look, I think this is really similar to what's happened in the Middle East. This is really similar to, we hear a lot of people in the Biden administration, in the Trump administration, who are convinced that they will turn Russia against China. That's just not going to happen. And that, during the Cold War, the late Cold War, the Brzezinski period, after the USA suffered a massive defeat in Vietnam, you had, the rise of the Trilateral Commission. Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski were paid basically by the Rockefellers and their foundations to develop kind of a new strategy for the USA in defeating communism around the world. And the new strategy was to kind of divide the global communist movement and play Russia and China against each other, confuse anti-imperialist forces throughout the Middle East. We know about the Afghan trap. And the idea was, we had all of these widespread anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements that were rising in the 1970s. And rather than just directly attack them, play favorites, be friendly to some and back some against others, and keep them confused and sow confusion in the rising anti-imperialist camp. That was a very, very effective strategy. And it appears that the United States, they saw that as a winning strategy during the Cold War, and they're trying to implement it again, but they're not able to. It's not going to work. The reason that you'll not be able to separate Russia and China right now is because Russia and China are economically tied to each other. During the Cold War, during the early years of the Cold War, China was a very, very poor country, and it was reliant on the Soviet Union for aid. And Khrushchev basically thought he could control Chinese foreign policy by saying, look, we're helping you build your power plants and hospitals, do what we say. Mao wasn't going to hear that, and that's what caused the initial divide. But that's not the case anymore. Now China's the second largest economy in the world, and Russia's relationship with China is not based on China needing Russia to give them stuff or Russia needing China to give them stuff. It's about the fact that China is an industrial powerhouse, but to run their industries, they need lots of oil and gas. And Russia has restored its economy from the disastrous fall of the Soviet Union by creating two gigantic oil and gas companies, Gazprom and Rosneft, and their economy is centered around oil and gas. And then on top of that, both Russia and China have been subjected to a huge amount of sanctions by the United States and its allies. So China is buying lots of Russian oil and lots of Russian might and Russia is happy to sell China lots of oil and gas, and they're economically tied. And, maybe Xi Jinping and Putin, maybe they might not agree about this or that. I mean, they seem to get along pretty well based on everything I've seen, but that's not the issue. They're economically linked to each other, and you're not going to be able to pull them apart. And it seems that Trump and some of his supporters are under the illusion that they'll be able to pull them apart. You're not going to be able to. What they did during the Cold War was very different. That was a very different time. This is similar to the failed Obama strategy in the Middle East. Obama's strategy was to polarize the Middle East and the Muslim world between allies of Iran and allies of Saudi Arabia. And that policy continued for the entire Obama administration. There was demonization of Shia Muslims, and then there was the war in Syria, which they very much tried to make it a Sunni versus Shia conflict, and they tried to isolate Iran. That continued during Trump's first term. There was the talk of creating an Arab NATO in the Middle East to oppose Iran. But now that policy has completely fallen to shreds. Why? Well, first of all, Iran and Saudi Arabia are friends again. They established diplomatic relations thanks to China. China invited them both and established relationships. And now the entire Muslim world is outraged at Israel. And what Israel is doing is unified against Israel. And everyone can see that it's Iran's allies, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis in Yemen, that are the main fighters against Israel. So you're not going to be able to isolate Iran. And that they're trying to play Brzezinski games and divide these anti-imperialist countries. But these countries are not held together at this point by ideology. They are held together by economic ties and bonds. And so you're not going to be able to rip economic ties and bonds. You're just not going to be able to do that. And U.S. leaders think
hence the rise of BRICS.
Yeah, U.S. leaders, they have this outdated playbook. During the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, if the USA put sanctions on a country, they were done, right? The USA put sanctions. Cuba, it was very bad. There was not starvation in Cuba, but there were food shortages. They only had electricity for a few hours a day. It was very bad in Cuba in the 90s. North Korea, there was starvation. Iraq, there was starvation because of the policies. Now the USA puts sanctions on a country and they say, okay, we'll trade with Russia, we'll trade with China. You know, it doesn't have the same effect. And so the U.S. leaders, their idea that they're going to manipulate the global anti-imperialist forces against each other, it's not going to happen. And the fact that the USA has, basically, gone back and reversed itself on so many policies means that a lot of these countries, the idea that the USA is going to be their friend and court them. I remember, just a year before this special military operation started in Ukraine, you'll remember Belarus was kind of at odds with Russia. Do you remember this? Belarus and Russia were not getting along too well. There was some economic disagreements, and the USA was making overtures friendly to Lukashenko. And then they had an election in Belarus, and the USA tried to turn it into a color revolution against Lukashenko. And Lukashenko said, oh, boy, all right. And he immediately became friends. And now Belarus is a key ally of Russia in the special military operation.
Didn't Samantha Power go to Belarus?
Oh, they tried. They tried really hard.
After she went to Ukraine with the Maidan coup, she went to Belarus. Yeah, and because I remember saying, when Samantha Power comes to town, it's time to go on vacation. Because
yeah, they were trying. They were hoping that they could manipulate Belarus and Russia against each other, and it wasn't going to happen. And then people can see that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and they got invaded. People can see that Libya got rid of their nuclear program, and Barack Obama and Gaddafi were very close. And Gaddafi was telling everyone that Obama was his little African son, and he was disavowing a lot of his longtime allies and bringing the United States in there. And they arranged for the guy who was accused of bombing Lockerbie to be released by the British authorities. And they gave him a big parade in Libya. And Gaddafi was convinced that America was his friend. And look what happened in Libya. And then the Iran nuclear deal, right? The P5+1 nuclear conclusion. Iran gave up almost all of its peaceful nuclear energy program, and they got Qasem Soleimani killed, and they got. So at this point, the idea that we're going to lure countries to break with the other anti-imperialist countries by signing a deal with the United States is not going to happen. I mean, they're not going to fall for it. They're just not going to fall for it. And so we need to have a policy, I would argue, in the United States that's based on the assumption that this new economy is going to be here. It's not going away. And that rather than fighting against it, we need to find a way that we can trade with it to our own benefit, right? That is, you were at our event that we did in DC where we had a banner highlighting the bridge over the Bering Sea. Right? Because China has called for that bridge to be created. Russia has wanted that bridge for years. And that I hear Donald Trump and the stuff he says about Canada and all of that, but part of me thinks, well, maybe there's something there because Alaska is not that far from Russia. And if we could get a bridge, a tunnel through the Bering Sea, connecting Alaska to Russia, that would get us closer to the rising new economy. And that's something that we should advocate. And so these are wild times that we live in at the end of the day. But we need to understand that this Western globalist financial system is doomed and that there is a rising new world. And China is a big essential part of it, as is Russia, as are other countries. And that America will get a better deal if we just be part of this. Just accept it, right? You can't always be king of the hill. When I was a kid, there was a game King of the Mountain, right? Where, one kid had to get to the top of the mountain. And the way the Western leaders view it is that they're already at the top of the mountain. So they're announcing game over. We're just going to stay up here forever. It's not going to work that way. Human beings want more than they already have. They want to build. There's people rising up from poverty around the world. So let's accept it and let's share the top of the mountain with some other people. I think that's really the only hope that we have as a country. The only future America really has is recognizing that we can be part of this new world. But in order to do that, we need to stop fighting against it.
And that's the natural outcome of empires. And they rise and they fall. And name me one that hasn't, and I don't think you'd be able to. As you mentioned, we're in crazy times. Let me shift gears for a moment here and talk about I want to get your take on what's happening with El Salvador, and this whole deportation issue with Kilmar Garcia, and the fact that the president of El Salvador was in the United States meeting in the White House yesterday and said very clearly, "I'm not sending this guy back." And you've got Marco Rubio saying, "Oh, this is a foreign policy issue, and the courts have absolutely no power, no leverage on foreign policy issues." When in fact, basically, this is a kidnapping, and the United States government kidnapped someone that was in the country lawfully, and now seems to be advocating, you know what I'm trying to say, its responsibility to bring this man back. And I have been saying to folks that this really has nothing to do with immigration and has everything to do with due process. And the Trump administration, this is a trial balloon to see how far they can get away with sending people out of the country without due process, because as Donald Trump is saying now, he wants to look at doing this with American prisoners.
Well, I think the whole thing is absolutely sickening. And I mean, it's just deeply wrong on many, many, many levels. And I suspect that Bukele saying that he won't send this person back is a favor to Trump. It's a way that Trump can not comply. It's like a loophole, right? He'll say, because the Supreme Court has said he has to send this guy back. So now if Bukele, the other country, won't send him back, right? Bukele doesn't have to listen to the Supreme Court, but that should set a precedent that you can't send people there, right? If the U.S. government is sending people to foreign countries for crimes, and the U.S. Courts can't get them back, there's people who go to prison all the time and get released. And
paying those countries to take the prisoner.
Yeah, this policy needs to be absolutely abolished. There is just absolutely no justification for it. It's interesting. I know in some of the smaller U.S. states, like I believe in Vermont, right? Vermont is small enough, they don't have their own prison. So they send their prisoners to Michigan. And that is very hard on the families, and et cetera. But sending them to a foreign country, right? And now we're seeing that. So, in theory, right, you could be charged with murder, right? And you're convicted. And so they send you to El Salvador, and then they find some DNA evidence that you didn't do it. Well, you're shit out of luck. That right there says that we shouldn't be sending people to El Salvador. So my hope is that this policy will be abolished on the basis of this situation that should never have happened. And this whole thing is absolutely crazy. I will say that there is an element, and this is where we want to look a little bit deeper, obviously, than just the moral outrage about the situation. There is an element of these gangs, the Tren de Aguila, I believe, I forget the name in Venezuela. I'm not getting the name right in Venezuela, and then MS-13. That gang in Venezuela has been an anti-Maduro gang that has been used by the U.S. government against Maduro. And that is a fact that nobody brings up. I've seen a lot of conservatives try to blame the gang on Maduro, which is absurd. He imprisoned them. These are the people he's been fighting against for years. And then I just see kind of moral outrage, But this is a particularly nasty group of folks that the U.S. government has cultivated against Venezuela. And that there are people within the deep state who don't like the fact that we use groups like that as proxies. And that seems to be, when you listen to Tulsi Gabbard and a lot of the statements she's made over the years, when you listen to some of these people in the deep state, and a lot of Trump's rhetoric about the drug cartels and all of that is that there is knowledge within the lower levels of law enforcement in the United States that they're not allowed to go after drug gangs on a local level because higher level law enforcement has infiltrated them and is engaging in some kind of long-term operations with them, operations against the Venezuelan government, operations against the government of Nicaragua, for example, and that, the higher levels of law enforcement that are connected with intelligence have kind of cultivated these gangs and are using them as proxies, and that a lot of lower level cops I remember when Donald Trump was running, he was saying things like, I could stop the murders in Chicago. I know I could make them stop. But what he's saying is that there are local cops in Chicago that are saying, look, there's these gangs that are doing bad things. But before they go after them, they have to call somebody at the federal office and they say, no, you can't touch this. And we can't tell you why. And that part of, what you might call globalism and part of U.S. foreign policy is the USA using these groups as proxy forces. I also think, and this is interesting, Guantanamo Bay, right, was set up right after 9/11. But what's interesting is that there are a number of Taliban officials that were in Guantanamo Bay that are now in the government of Afghanistan. And that's very, very odd. But for years, they were in this very remote prison facility run by the U.S. government where they were tortured. They were subject to all kinds of strange, who knows what went on. And then they were released and now they're running the government. And you have to wonder if there's some desire to take these various kind of very extreme violent people like terrorists, like drug cartels, and get them in a place where you can subject them to all kinds of mind control and, I don't know what goes on in these places, and then release them once again. And that is something that, it sounds conspiratorial, it sounds tinfoil hatty, but look at the history of MK Ultra, and it's very, very weird. And so, the drug cartels, we know they've been used as proxies, just as the Islamic extremists of the Middle East were used as proxies. And now there's a desire to set up certain facilities where we catch them and hold them. And they're not subject to U.S. law. We can torture them. We can do things we could never do on U.S. soil to U.S. prisoners to them. That's certainly disturbing, on a number of levels. And that I think there may be a desire on lower level law enforcement to just fight these people. And they don't like being restrained. But there's also a desire of higher level law enforcement to get a better grip on these people and see who could be used. This is all a very, very strange situation. We have no idea. We really don't know what went on in Guantanamo Bay. And we have no idea what's going on in El Salvador's prisons. We don't know. But we do know that these forces have been used by the American government in the past.
Can you give me just a couple more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Because the other aspect of this El Salvador issue is the constitutional fight between the executive branch and the judiciary, as the legislative branch has abdicated. That's the word I was struggling with before. Abdicated its responsibility of oversight and check and balance. So you have, again, little Marco Rubio saying the courts have no say here. You have other elements in the Trump administration saying, I don't care what the judges say. We're coming. We're doing what we want to do. So beyond the what we're seeing play out in El Salvador, this constitutional crisis that we find ourselves confronted with, as we go back to what's his name? The guy I call the Trump whisperer, Steve Bannon, talking about the deconstruction of the administrative state. And I think this is one of the elements of that deconstruction, Caleb Maupin.
Well, indeed. I mean, this obviously doesn't fit U.S. constitutional law. This obviously does not fit the standard operating procedure in the United States. And I find the conversation around it to be very, very bizarre on a number of levels, because, a lot of Trump's supporters are not happy with it. Look at a lot of libertarians in Trump's camp. I mean, and that's one thing I was kind of impressed to see, that there were a lot of Trump supporters who spoke up for Mahmoud Khalil and said that deporting somebody for his political views is wrong. Ann Coulter spoke up for Mahmoud Khalil. Thomas Massey spoke up for Mahmoud Khalil. And that there was a lot of opposition to this move from a lot of Republicans, and that's certainly significant to point out. Also, that the opposition to it from Democrats, it's almost like it's not unique, it's not special. It just kind of fits in with this kind of like noise. Trump is a dictator. Trump is Hitler. It's like it's almost like it's not really. It's not like their main point. They're not focused on this. And it's like, of course, Trump does bad things. Of course, Trump is a dictator. Of course, he would deport people. Of course, he would send people to prison camps, and they're not. Why is this issue in itself not generating specific outrage? I think that's that's what why is this not a big point of debate? And when so many Trumpers are against it, when the Democrats are against it, but they're not like especially against it, this is all very weird. They're trying to reset the rules of the game. That's what's clear to me, is that, American politics, Ronald Reagan used to say we're all friends after 6 o'clock. We've known for a while they are not all friends after 6 o'clock, January 6th, a lot of the unrest that has gone on. And the rules of the game through which the elites can not only go after us, but can go after each other are being renegotiated at this time. And this is a process called Bonapartism, where there are divisions within the ruling class amid an economic crisis. And so I would argue that, this is, Louis Bonaparte. That's, Napoleon's nephew, who became the military dictator of France in 1852. What did he do? He deported thousands of very wealthy people who opposed him. There was a group called the Party of Order, a conservative political party that was against him. And when he seized power, he deported a lot of them to North Africa. And there were a lot of very wealthy people from France. The military rounded them up and sent them to North Africa because they didn't agree with Louis Bonaparte. And he was trying to stabilize capitalism in France. And so to do it, he had to forcibly deport all kinds of rich and powerful people. And that's Bonapartism. It's a natural process of economic decay in capitalism. So I would observe it from that perspective as well.
And final point here, because I think we can't have this part of the conversation without talking about the attack on academia. I think it's wrong for people to attribute this solely to Donald Trump, because we saw this really start playing itself out as it relates to the Biden administration. And this whole idea that now all of a sudden anti-Semitism, which I would never, ever support or recommend or advance, but somehow now, for as heinous and as ugly as anti-Semitism is, it's not illegal. And what most of these individuals are protesting against has nothing to do with anti-Semitism and has everything to do with anti-Zionism. But it appears, in fact, there was a Pew study released today that now 53% of Americans are now not looking at Israel in a favorable manner, which tells me that the Israeli lobby has come to realize very early in the game they're losing, if not have lost, this argument, and that is really contributing to a lot of what we're seeing play itself out on our college campuses.
Well, sure. I mean, there's the old folk tale. I believe it comes from China, that there were two men arguing very loudly in a public place, and they're just screaming at each other. And there's a child watching with his father, and he says, "Well, why doesn't one man hit the other man?" And the father says, "Well, because the man who throws the first punch will be admitting that the other guy was right." And that's kind of the situation we're in. If you have to get people fired from their jobs, if you have to deport them from the country because they use their free speech to disagree with you, that's a pretty strong confession that you're wrong. You wouldn't have to do that otherwise. And yeah, I mean, look, this really points to a theme that I just keep coming home with. We've got to get beyond team sports. It's not about red team or blue team, because a lot of precedents were set for this during the Biden years. And I saw a lot of activist groups that dedicated themselves to trying to get Republican organizations banned from college campuses because they were allegedly homophobic, transphobic, whatever. And, they were doing all kinds of crazy things, digging into people's emails and Discord servers to try and find proof. And now those very same groups are having members of their organizations kicked off of college campuses for allegedly being anti-Semitic. Well, you helped set the precedent where, if the school disagrees with something you said, they can get rid of your organization or expel you. And that, we never want to give that power to a state that is not our ally. And I don't think the U.S. government is our ally, and that we shouldn't give the U.S. government or the U.S. establishment university system the ability to get rid of people based on their views. If people engage in misconduct, if people engage in fraud, that's one thing. But, this goes back to, I remember when they went after Ward Churchill. Do you remember that? That was during the Bush years. Ward Churchill was the top Native American scholar in the United States, and he wrote an essay about 9/11. And for 100 days, Fox News talked about nothing but that. And they tried to fire him for it, but they couldn't. So then they accused him of academic fraud on ridiculous basis and fired him for academic fraud. And then he won a settlement in court that said, he didn't commit academic fraud, but they still wouldn't give him his job back. So they gave him, lots of money, but they didn't give him his job back. And that was a dangerous precedent that was set. I think that was back during the first Bush administration, or the second Bush administration, that precedent was set. And that, academics should be able to say what they say, and that part of the reason that tenure exists is because we want academics to offend people. We want them to say things that are unconventional. We want them to challenge. They're supposed to be like I'm trying to think of like the troubleshooter, or I'm trying to think of an example, but it's like you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, right? You have Job, the book of Job. Right. Mm-hmm. And in the book of Job, Satan is not portrayed as God's enemy. He's portrayed as one of God's angels whose job it is to test Job's faith by subjecting him to hardship. Right. And in theory, that's what academia is supposed to be. They're not supposed to be our friends. They're supposed to be doing all kinds of research and pointing to America's flaws, pointing to how we could do better, showing us the other side of the story. In theory, that's what academics are supposed to be. They're supposed to be, the troubleshooter of America who show our bad side and help us learn by challenging us and getting us to think. That's what academia is supposed to be. And that's why the tenure process was invented, in my understanding. But we're at the point that no longer stands. And the other thing that I've always pointed out too, and that Harvard, right? I saw just today Trump called out Harvard, right? So if you read, and I've read Brzezinski and the Cold War strategists, I've dug deep into that stuff. And if you want to understand foreign policy and a lot of the way U.S. media works, look at that stuff. The first chapter of his book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski spends a whole long time talking about Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League. And he talks about how those schools serve an international purpose for the United States. Students from all over the world go there, and they learn to love America, and they make business connections, and they go back to their home country, and they become allies of the United States, defenders of foreign policy, right? And that Harvard and Yale and schools like that, they really make a big effort to show America to the students who come there in a very, very good light. So having pro-Palestine protests at Harvard and Yale and all that is very important, because there's a lot of Muslims who believe the USA is the evil empire. It's oppressing people. So if they come to Harvard and Yale and they see that, well, America supports Israel, but look, there's all these students who disagree and they're free to say what they disagree about, that's good PR for America. But there's so many hardline pro-Zionists at Harvard, they just can't stand it. And so Harvard, to serve its foreign policy intelligence purpose for the United States, it needs to put on a show of being all inclusive, et cetera. But there's so many Zionist donors and others who just won't tolerate it. They're in a weird spot. And yeah.
Well, and this will be my final question, and thank you for giving me the additional time. That takes me right to the next point, which is you don't really hear the mainstream media explaining the real dynamic here when they keep talking about going after Harvard, going after Columbia, going after UPenn because of their anti-Semitic treatment of Jewish students. But it's Jewish students in many regards that are leading these protests. When you look at the folks that went into Trump Tower a couple of weeks ago, there were 150 members of Not in Our Name and Never Again, and some of these other very, very they're Jewish anti-Zionist organizations. I think you had 75 students maybe 2 weeks ago chaining themselves to the fence at Columbia in support of Mahmoud Khalil. They were Jewish students doing this. So, what you don't hear from Rachel Maddow and what you don't hear from others on MSNBC and CNN, they don't challenge that lie. They're very clear not to tell the truth about who is also involved in these protests. They won't touch that one.
I believe you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And equating, criticism or opposition to Israel with hatred of Jews, that is a fallacy that is all throughout Western media. It's just kind of standard. And anyone who's been to any of these protests knows it's overwhelmingly Jewish folks that are involved. When it comes to who are white leftists in America, it's largely Jewish folks. I mean, that's for historical reasons that, I'm sure we can get into in another podcast sometime. That's just the reality. So yeah, the idea that all these protesters are out there preaching hatred for Jews, wanting to kill Jews or something like that, they're definitely not doing that.
Caleb Maupin, as always, my brother, thank you so much for your time. Great for your extra time as well. Greatly appreciate that analysis. And as always, we look forward to having you back. Thanks for joining me today.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Appreciate it. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Ajamu Baraka will be joining us as we talk about the outcome and some of the suspected undermining of a free and fair election in Ecuador. He'll join us tomorrow. Please follow and subscribe, share the show, leave a review. And folks, those of you that are watching on other platforms, please go to YouTube and subscribe. Greatly need to increase that subscriber base and contribute to the Patreon aspect of this as well. Follow us on social media. All the links are below. We're doing this for you. And go back and you can watch old episodes, old broadcasts. You can listen to other brilliant commentary by Caleb Maupin from other programs. And so remember that this is where the analysis of politics and culture and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow with Ajamu Baraka. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.